And now for black, it's better to just develop this knight either to c6 or d7. But instead, here computer made a mistake by pushing c5, allowing white to bring this knight further to b5, threatening knight to d6 check. Okay, so now king to d7, stopping this knight from going to c7 square, but that's also creates some problems because as you can see, the white king is safe on d1 square, whereas the black king on d7 is blocking this light square bishop. Instead, a move like knight to a6 might be the better option for black, which also develops this knight as well as also allows black to develop this light square bishop, because now bishop to f4 by Kasparov, creating more pressure over this c7 square, but black can easily tackle this by pushing a6, creating a7 square for this rook, but instead he goes for. And guys, in this position, now you might be shocked that instead of pushing either a6 or knight to a6, here black can go for this amazing move knight to f6, allowing white to play knight to c7. And now you can see no one can save this rook and black is losing, right? But no, you are wrong, because in this position, here black can go for this another great move knight to h5, attacking this bishop, and here the best move for black is to bring this knight back to d5. But let's suppose if white becomes greedy and he decides to capture this rook by knight takes a8, that will be a mistake because of knight takes f4, and you can see this knight on a8 is now trapped. So let's suppose if this game continues like bishop takes c4, b6, and in the next move bishop to b7, and you can see suddenly black is back into the game. But in the actual game, after this move, here black made a mistake by knight to c6, and now it's better for white to just go for knight to c7, which attacks this rook. And let's suppose if rook to b8, and as white, how will you continue this game? Yes, you can capture this pawn on c4, but there's something better than that, because in this position white can go for king to c2, trying to bringing this rook into the game, and you can see this position is completely winning for white. But in the actual game, after this move, here Kasparov goes for king to c2 with the same idea of rook to d1 check. And since white is now threatening to capture on c4, so that's why knight to e5. And again, white can give a check, but simply bishop to f4, attacking this knight, and black defends it by pushing f6. Okay, so now bishop to e6 by Kasparov, a good move asking for bishop exchange because he knows that if uh, s- if this bishop comes off the board, the rook endgame is winning because white king is active on c2, and on the next move white will bring this another rook in, and you can see this will be over for black. So that's why after bishop to e6 he goes for. And after that, rook to a7 by Kasparov, targeting this a6 pawn as well as preparing for rook to d7. And now rook to c6, a good move preparing for rook to h8, which will target this h2 pawn as well as which also defends this h7 pawn if white goes for a rook d7. Okay, so now rook to h7 may be possible, threatening to mate in 1, but Kasparov goes for g4. Here basically he's trying to deflect this rook so that he can go for rook to h7, threatening mate in 1, as well as also preparing to target this h6 pawn. So that's why after seeing this, here black brings his e rook on e6, defending this h6 pawn, and now black is threatening to capture this pawn on f3. And now giving a check from f8 square might be the better option, but instead he goes for g5, which is a slight inaccuracy because after takes, rook takes g5, and basically this exchange allows black to bring this rook to h4, which keeps an eye over this h5 pawn. But instead of this, here black made a mistake by capturing on e4, and guys, now to win this game, white has to just find the move h6, and this position now is completely winning for white. This is because let's suppose if black tries to stop this pawn by rook to h4, rook to g7 check, the only move is king to f6, rook to f8 checkmate. But guys, after rook takes e4, Kasparov missed that move and instead he blunders by rook to h7 check. And that's a blunder because now this h5 pawn can be easily stopped by black. Let's see how. And finally, you can see here black successfully stops this h7 pawn, which is the only main asset for white from which white could win, because in the end you can see white is a pawn down. And now you can see it's a rook and a pawn end game, and let's see how Kasparov converts this into a win. And guys, now comes the most interesting part of this game. In this position here, black made a mistake by rook to f3, completely giving a free pawn to white. But let me go back to the move, which is rook to a5. Yes, so now I have a question for you. As of black, how will you continue this game? The best move for black is to either get closer to this pawn so that he can stop this from promotion, or black can also continue by giving a check from f4 square by rook to f4 check. But what if king takes b5? And guys, now let's take a look at this position. It's important for black to get closer to the 8th rank so that he can stop this pawn from promotion, as I said, which is the only key which can make this position winning for white. But let's suppose if black is not careful and instead he tries to give another check, for example rook to b5 check. Now this is completely losing for black because of king to b6, and obviously black can't exchange the rooks because then white will promote his pawn. So let's suppose if he gives another check from f6 square, king to c7, rook to f7 check, king to c6, rook to f6 check, king to b5, rook to f5 check, king to b4, rook to f4 check. If he tries to give multiple checks, simply rook to d5, taking control over this d file so that this king cannot enter. So let's suppose if king to e6, rook to d1, rook to f2. If he tries to give a check, simply c5, rook to b2 check, king to a5, rook to c2, king to b6, rook to b2 check, king to c7, rook to c2, c6, king to e7, rook to a1, a great move so that black cannot enter to a2 square. So let's suppose if rook to c3, king to b7, rook to b3 check, king to c8, rook to c3, and you can see here white is getting closer to the promotion. Rook to a7, rook to b4, rook to b7, rook to g4, rook to b8, king to b8, and now you can see no one can stop this pawn from promotion. Okay, so let's go back to our original game. After the move rook takes b5, here Kasparov gives a check, and yeah, basically this endgame gets closer to what I told you earlier. King to e7, rook to d1, rook to f2, king to b5, rook to c2, c5, rook to b2 check, and the final move by Kasparov is king to a6. And in this position the computer resigned. As I said, as I already showed you the previous variation, you can see at any cost this position is winning for white. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.